Texas, summer of 1888. The sun came down like fire, cracking the earth and the spirits that had long learned to endure. In the small market square of Dry Creek, dust rose thick as smoke. Flies buzzed around the old wooden posts, once used to tie horses, now used to tie people. Tessa Boyd stood there. Her hands were clasped before her stomach, her faded blue dress bleached pale by the sun. Her stepfather, a man with a scorched face and hungry eyes, stood on the saloon porch, shouting like a vendor selling broken wares. "She ain't pretty, but she works. Washes, cooks, sews, don't talk back. Who'll start the bidding?" No one answered. Only a few dry laughs and the squeak of wind through loose wooden doors. Tessa didn't cry. Sweat slid down her neck, mixing with dust, burning at the corner of her lips. She stared at her worn sandals, remembering the morning. Her stepmother had made her iron this old dress, saying at least, "Don't let them call you dirty." The voice had been dry, without a trace of care. "Stand up straight, don't slouch," her stepfather barked. "A bowed head don't sell." She stood straight, but she didn't meet anyone's eyes. Tessa knew she'd been sold long before today. Sold the moment folks began comparing her skin to flour, her voice to ash. A group of men gathered nearby, smoking and whispering. "She's one of the Boyds, right?" "Yeah, half-breed. Daddy's dead. The drunk that married her mama's selling her off to pay his whiskey debt. Look at her. Not bad, if she's washed." Laughter cracked through the heat and stench of sweat. She bit her lip, her heart beat steady but heavy. Then someone arrived. A man on a brown horse, his shadow long across the sun-baked ground. He stopped before the crowd without a word. No one knew his face, only that his horse was fine, his reins clean, his saddle free of dust. His face was tanned, his eyes a cold, steady blue. "Who's that?" "Mercer," someone muttered. "Hank Mercer. Owns a ranch up north. Got money, keeps to himself." He didn't dismount right away. He just looked at Tessa, long enough to make the others uneasy. Then he stepped down, boots striking the ground, with a low, final sound. Her stepfather's face changed at once, splitting into a greedy smile. "Well now, Mr. Mercer, didn't expect to see you here. You looking for help around the place? This girl's obedient, don't ask for nothing. Just needs, how much?" Hank's voice cut through, low and even. The man blinked. Well, whatever you think's fair." Mercer didn't haggle. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and dropped it onto the table. The clink of coins sliced through the heat like a blade. "Enough?" The man snatched it up quick, grinning wide. "More than enough." Tessa stayed still, not understanding what had just happened. Hank turned to her. "Get on the wagon." His tone wasn't harsh, yet it left the whole street silent. Tessa stepped forward, her legs trembling slightly. As she climbed up, one of the drunks near the saloon grabbed her arm, sneering, "Careful, mister. Best wash her first." Mercer tilted his head. A second later, the sound of a slap cracked the air. The man hit the dirt hard. Hank didn't say a word. He just took Tessa's wrist, firm, not rough, and helped her onto the wagon. The wheels began to turn along the red dust road. Tessa didn't look back, though she could hear her stepfather counting coins, his laughter thick and broken. Wind blew grit across her face. She lifted a hand to shield her eyes. Hank didn't glance her way. He reached behind the seat, pulled out a thick coat, and set it in her lap. "Put on the coat," he said, eyes fixed ahead. "It's colder past the ridge." She hesitated, then slipped it on. The coat was still warm, smelling of horsehide and wood smoke. For the first time in her life, someone had given her shelter from the sun without asking for something in return. The wagon rolled farther from town. Behind them, Dry Creek shrank into a trail of dust under a burning sky. Ahead, the hills shimmered faint purple through the heat. Tessa didn't know what awaited her. Another kind of bondage or something else entirely. She pulled the coat tighter around her and glanced sideways at the man beside her. He sat upright, one hand steady on the reins, his eyes unyielding. And in that silence, she heard something strange, not contempt, not pity, but a space wide enough for someone to breathe. The road north wound through scorched land, each mile shimmering under a sun that burned like molten iron. The wagon wheels dragged heavy over cracked earth, the clash of metal and stone so dry it seemed to grind the silence between them into dust. Tessa sat beside Hank Mercer, her hands folded tight in her lap. She had never gone farther than the edge of town, never known that beyond Dry Creek lay anything other than smoke, grit, and the kind of stares that cut deeper than words. Now the world stretched before her in bands of burnt grass, a few cactus shrubs standing like the footprints of those who'd left long ago. She looked down at her hands, darkened, calloused, scarred, still holding the soot of the morning when she'd been put up for sale. The air smelled of leather, smoke, and sweat, the hard scent of the West, where survival had its own kind of perfume. Without a word, Hank reached behind him and handed her a folded cloth. "Cover your face," he said to eyes on the road ahead. "This stretch gets dusty." She hesitated, then nodded, wrapping the scarf around her head. The heat pressed against her skin, sweat tracing down her neck. But under the cloth, she found it easier to breathe, not because it blocked the dust, but because it hid her from the world. As the wagon climbed a hill, a cough escaped her, dry and small. At once, Hank pulled the reins and stopped the team. "Drink." He poured water from a leather canteen and held it out to her. No glance, no word beyond that. She took it, drinking in slow sips. The water was warm, tasting faintly of iron, but it filled her chest with something she hadn't felt in years, the sense that someone saw her as human. "Thank you," she whispered. Hank gave a single nod and flicked the reins. By late afternoon, the land changed color, red earth dimming to bronze beneath the setting sun. On the horizon, a few dark shapes rose from the plain. "Mercer Hill," he said simply. Tessa looked ahead. There were no white fences or signs of wealth, just a two-story wooden house, a few barns, and an old windmill turning slow in the dry wind. Yet everything stood in quiet order, the kind that could only come from hands that had known loss. When the wagon stopped, Hank stepped down first, unhitched the horses, then turned and offered his hand. She hesitated. "Step down," he said. Her fingers touched his, rough, warm, solid as oak, before she pulled back, lowering her gaze. From the porch, an older woman appeared. "Mr. Mercer, this girl is—" "She stays here." His voice left no room for question. The woman nodded. "Room's downstairs, by the kitchen. Supper's at 6. Tessa followed her inside. The house smelled of wood, smoke, and the faint sweetness of bread left from the morning. On the walls hung bits of a life, a worn saddle, a weathered hat, a photograph of a fair-haired woman holding wildflowers. Tessa paused to look, but didn't dare ask. Night fell fast. The small room she was given held a bed, a wool blanket, and a narrow window facing the prairie. She set the scarf and coat he'd given her on the chair and sat still. Outside, the windmill creaked in the distance, its rhythm joining the whisper of crickets. Lying down, she stared at the wooden ceiling. For the first time in years, she was in a place where no one would call her name in anger. No door would slam open. No hand would strike. But the quiet unsettled her more than noise ever had. Somewhere outside, the wind moved across the shingles, sighing low. Footsteps approached, slow, firm, stopping right beyond her door. There was no knock. Only a voice, low and rough, came through the gap. "You're safe here." She held her breath. No answer came. The door didn't open. Only the sound of wind remained, and the faint scent of rain carried from the far hills. Tessa turned her face toward the wall, tears soaking the pillow. Not from fear, but from the strange mercy. Hearing those words, spoken without demand, without promise. Outside, dew began to gather. Over the roof of Mercer Hill, the wind softened at last. And somewhere within that silence, she felt, maybe this was where life could begin again. Dawn at Mercer Hill did not come with a rooster's cry, but with the low, familiar whistle of wind threading through the wooden fences. No one called her name. No one gave her orders. Yet Tessa had been awake since the sky was still purple. She rekindled the stove, swept the ashes, reheated last night's pot of coffee. The thin smoke drifted through the small kitchen, mingling with the damp scent of earth after the night's mist. Before the sun cleared the ridge, she was already at the stables. One of the colts had a cut on its hind leg, likely from a stone in the paddock. No one had told her, but she brought water, wiped away the blood, and tore a strip from her own dress to bandage it. The young horse trembled, snorting softly. She placed a hand on its neck and whispered, "Easy now." Out in the yard, Hank was fixing the fence. His brown coat hung on a post, his back damp with sweat. He glanced over without a word. When he saw her mixing the feed, he gave a single nod, not a command, but a quiet acknowledgement. Tessa turned away. She still wasn't used to that look. Not prying, not pitying. Just seeing her, simply, as one person sees another. For breakfast, she laid out coffee, eggs, and cornbread. Hank came in, sawdust still on his hands. "Smells good," he said. She lowered her gaze. "I just used what was left in the pantry." "Good choice." That was all. No praise, no correction. But his voice, deep and steady, made her heartbeat stumble once. The day moved like the horses in their stalls. Slow, steady, orderly. When Mavis, the housekeeper, found her washing blankets, she chuckled. "He didn't ask you to do that." Tessa replied, "No one has to ask me to clean the place I live in." After that, Mavis's eyes carried a softer warmth when they met hers. By late afternoon, sunlight slanted through the window as Tessa mended Hank's torn shirt. The rip at the shoulder closed neatly under her needle. When he passed by, she lifted her head, meaning to hand it over, and saw that he held a folded letter, its edges yellow with time. He sat down, read it quietly, then pressed it to his chest. She asked gently, "Bad news?" "Old," he said. "Letter from my brother. Died at Shiloh. I read it sometimes when it gets too quiet." He didn't look at her while he spoke, but something faint cracked in his tone, just enough to let the grief breathe. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply set the mended shirt on the table, careful not to disturb the fragile peace between them. The oil lamp flickered, its light brushing across her face, smooth brown skin, a trace of sweat at her temple, eyes deep and unafraid. Hank noticed, for the first time, that she no longer carried the wary tension she had on the day she arrived. Their eyes met, longer than necessary. No words followed. Then he rose slowly, opened a drawer, and took out a worn, leather-bound book. Its corners were frayed, spine cracked by years of use. He set it in her hands. "Psalms and sonnets," he said. "You can read?" She looked surprised. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me. Before she—" Her voice trailed off. He nodded once. "Then keep it. It's better read than gathering dust." Her fingers traced the faded inscription on the first page. "To H. Mercer, from A. Mercer, 1873. "Your brother gave you this?" "Day I left for the ranch," Hank said. "Told me I'd need company. He was right." Tessa clutched the book to her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just read it." As he stepped outside, the last light of day glowed on his shoulders. A solid figure she no longer feared. That night, she sat by the window, opened the book, and read softly, "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." A faint smile touched her lips. At Mercer Hill, no one spoke loudly. No one pried into another's past. Yet in that silence, something was taking root, small, unseen, and alive, like green shoots pushing through burnt ground. She closed the book, set it on the table, and blew out the lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the new fence, its creak steady and calm. Tessa closed her eyes, thinking of his hands as he'd placed the book in hers, strong, warm, and respectful. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone's debt, but like a promise being kept. In this land, rumors ran faster than wind. One word loosed in the market by morning could curl through every porch, every glass of whiskey, every whispered prayer in the little church on Main Street by nightfall. They said Hank Mercer had bought himself a black girl to warm his bed, that she slept in the downstairs room, without name, without freedom, that he paid to keep her silence, that there was singing at Mercer Hill each night, sweet but sinful to hear. Tessa heard the talk first from Mavis. The older woman set a tray of biscuits down and said softly, as though afraid her voice might break something delicate, "They say plenty, child. Don't let it matter. The good ones always get talked about." Tessa pressed her lips together and said nothing. She still rose before dawn, still mended shirts, still taught the two illiterate hands in the stables how to read and spell. Yet whenever she went into town for salt or flour, the stares had changed, half curiosity, half scorn. She could hear the muffled laughter behind her, the whispers not quite low enough to hide. "Mercer's new toy," someone said. She pretended not to hear, but her steps slowed. That day, Hank rode to town with her. He was silent as always, but in the market square, a wagon driver blocked their way, spat on the ground, and grinned. "Morning, Mr. Mercer. How's your purchase holding up?" The air turned to stone. Tessa stood behind the wagon, clutching the sack of supplies, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. Hank stepped down, slow, deliberate. The sound of his boots on gravel carried heavier than words. He faced the man squarely. Dust blew through the street, stinging eyes. Then, without warning, the sound of a fist broke the stillness, hard, final, echoing like thunder. The wagon driver crumpled, hat flying, blood bright on his lip. Hank's voice came low but clear. "She's no man's property." No one laughed. The market fell silent, save for the buzzing of flies over the fish stand. Hank turned away, his voice steady. "Let's go." On the way back, neither spoke. The road stretched long, the sky beginning to bruise toward dusk. When they crossed the bridge, Tessa noticed his hand on the reins, steady but trembling faintly. That evening, he sat at the table staring out the window. Mavis cleared the dishes quietly. Tessa stood in the corner, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. At last he said, "I can't fight every mouth in town. They'll keep talking." She answered softly, "You don't owe me that fight." He looked up. "No, but I owe you truth." A few days later, a painter arrived at Mercer Hill, a thin man with silver in his beard and a wooden case strapped behind him. Hank led him out to the garden. "I want a portrait," he said. "She's the subject." Tessa blinked. "Me?" "Just sit as you are," Hank said. "Nothing to pretend." That afternoon, she sat on a wooden chair among the herbs, the book psalms and sonnets resting in her lap, her plain brown dress catching the light. No one told her to smile. No one fussed with her hair. The painter worked slowly, brush whispering over canvas, while the sun leaned gold across her shoulder. 3 days later, it was done. Tessa hadn't seen it yet, but as she passed through the parlor, she stopped short. The painting hung on the main wall, where there had once been only empty space. There she was, sitting in the garden, hands dark and gentle over the open book, her gaze calm, unbowed. Behind her, the faint outline of wind-tossed leaves. Mavis stood behind her, sighing softly. "Beautiful child," Tessa murmured. "It's too much." From the staircase, Hank's voice answered, "It's the truth." The next day, a visitor came by. Seeing the painting, he asked, "Who is she?" Hank looked up at the portrait, his tone even. "The only one who never asked me for anything." Tessa heard it from the hall. Something warm surged through her chest, sharp and gentle at once. She understood then. No wall, no rumor could hide the light of what was real. That night, as she tidied the kitchen, Hank passed by and set psalms and sonnets back on the table. "You read well?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "Better when it's quiet." He nodded. "Then we'll keep it quiet." Outside, the wind swept along the new fence, steady as a breath, and somewhere beyond the reach of rumor, a silence had begun to feel like home. That afternoon, the air hung heavy with moisture. Low clouds pressed down as if the sky itself were sinking to earth. Mercer Hill stood silent beneath the weight of summer, the only sound the wind whistling through the barn doors, a warning carried on heat. Tessa was shaking out blankets to dry when she heard the sound of hooves. Through the shimmer of dust came a white horse, and astride it, a fair-skinned woman in a dark blue dress, hair coiled tight, lips red as wine. Her face pulled something old and unwanted from memory, blurred by time, but not erased. "Lucinda," Tessa whispered. Lucinda Boyd, daughter of the man who had sold her, his true child, but only Tessa's stepsister. Years ago, Lucinda's mother had run away from that man, from the hunger, the whiskey, and the shouting nights. Now, hearing he had once sold a girl for a fair price, Lucinda had come back, hoping there might still be something left to claim. She dismounted, brushed off her gloves, and let her eyes sweep over Tessa from head to toe, the way one sizes up a thing once discarded. "So this is where you ended up," she said with a tilted smile. "They said he sold you, but look at you now, living like a lady." Tessa answered quietly, "I live, that's all." Lucinda laughed. "Oh, you live all right. Rumor has it the good rancher didn't buy you for chores." The words fell hard, echoing through the yard like a stone dropped in a dry well. Hank appeared on the porch, hands rough with sawdust, his gaze darkening at the sight of the stranger. Lucinda turned sweetly toward him. "You must be Mr. Mercer. I'm family, in a way. My father was her stepfather. I came to see how little Tessa's doing after her transaction." Hank nodded once, offered no greeting, no invitation. "She's doing honest work here," he said. Lucinda raised an eyebrow. "Honest work? Well, that depends who's asking." Blood rose hot in Tessa's cheeks. "Lucinda, please!" But Lucinda only smiled, peeling off her gloves with a soft snap. "You always had that look," she said, stepping closer. "The kind that makes men think they're saving you, and somehow you always end up under their roof." Tessa's voice turned firm. "You left. You had a choice." "Of course I did," Lucinda said. "That's what makes me different." That night in the kitchen, Mavis shook her head. "That one brings trouble," she murmured. Tessa didn't answer. She stood by the window watching Lucinda down by the horse station, laughing with a few men. Their glances, their low chuckles, they spread quicker than chimney smoke. The next day in town, every eye seemed to follow Tessa. Some half smiled, some whispered behind their hands. "She's clever, that one. Mercer's woman, they say. She's been using those big brown eyes since Dry Creek." Tessa bit her lip and kept her back straight, bought her flour and walked, home with the air thick as ash inside her chest. When she reached Mercer Hill, Hank was locking the stable doors. One look at her face and he understood. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't let it touch you." "It already has," she replied. He didn't argue. He only passed her by, his shoulders heavy, the weight of a man who knew there were some battles fists could never win. By evening, Lucinda came again. She stood in the yard, her red dress catching the dying light. "So quiet here," she said, her voice sharp and mocking. "No wonder he keeps you. Men like the silent ones, easier to own." Tessa stood at the doorway, her hand tightening on the frame. "You don't know what he likes." Lucinda stepped closer, whispering near her ear. "I know what you are. A bought thing, pretending to be more." The words cut deep, clean as a blade. Tessa didn't cry. She met Lucinda's eyes and said slowly, "Maybe I was sold, but I learned to keep my worth. Can you say the same?" For a heartbeat, Lucinda froze. Her eyes filled with something colder than anger. "Don't get proud, Tessa. You were born beneath me, and you'll die beneath me." The wind rose, rain beginning to tap the earth, thunder rumbling low across the plains. Tessa turned away without a word. That night, Hank searched for her, but her room stood open. The coat he'd given her was gone. Outside, rain fell harder. Down the muddy road, a small figure walked alone, bareheaded, empty-handed, carrying nothing but a bleeding shame. Thunder cracked over the hills. Tessa didn't look back. Mercer Hill faded behind her in the storm, the porch light flickering like a call she no longer dared believe was meant for her. The rain came all night, not gentle, but furious, as if the sky itself was punishing the earth. Wind tore across the porch, branches cracked, and the road out of Mercer Hill turned into a strip of black mud deep as a man's ankle. Still, Hank rode out, his coat heavy with water, eyes scanning every trail that cut through the dark. He knew where she would go, down toward the lowlands, where the old creek wound past a forgotten hunter's shack the hands sometimes spoke of. Every mile he followed was marked by small, narrow footprints pressed deep in the mud. Wind lashed his face, rain stung like gravel. But he rode on. When he finally saw a flicker of light ahead, he dropped the reins and climbed down, wading through the mire. The lamp inside glowed weakly through a warped door, the breath of a dying flame. He pushed it open. The hinges cried. Tessa sat huddled near a pit of coals, her hair plastered to her neck, her thin coat soaked through. Her face was pale from cold, her eyes hollow, hands clenched so tight her knuckles shone white. When she saw him, she startled, then lowered her head. "Don't," Hank said softly, stepping closer. "Don't say anything yet." She turned away, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come. The rain—" "I've ridden through worse," he interrupted, kneeling beside her. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, drawing her close, his palm steady against her back. His skin was cold from the storm, but the warmth from him spread through her, and her shivering changed its rhythm. "I can't stay," she whispered, staring into the faint glow. "They'll never stop talking." He was silent for a long while. The roof roared under the downpour, thunder rolling across the plains. Then he spoke, low, rough, certain. "Let them talk. I don't answer to them." She looked up. In the flickering light their eyes met, hers bright with tears, his dark as the night beyond the door. He reached out, brushed the rain from her cheek. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. For the first time he was not master, and she was not a bought thing. They were simply two souls, worn and weathered by a world that had spoken over them too long, now finding each other in a silence no one could steal. Outside, thunder rolled again. Inside, their breath mingled in the hush between heartbeats. "Tessa," Hank murmured, almost a prayer. "You've done nothing wrong." "Then why does it feel like I have?" "Because the world's louder than the truth." A faint smile touched her lips. "You shouldn't risk your name for me." He met her gaze, unblinking. "I risked nothing. You're the only thing worth keeping." She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Tears came instead, not from fear, not from shame, but from the simple ache of finally being seen without a price. He drew her closer. The warmth of their bodies met, carrying the scent of rain, smoke, horse, and old timber, the scent of survival. There was no desperate kiss, no rush of passion. Only his hand tracing the side of her face, sliding down to her neck, resting at her shoulder. She closed her eyes, letting the space between them fade, the way two final notes resolve into one. Time slowed inside the cabin. The storm still raged, but within, only the sound of breathing and the heartbeat steady under her palm. "I thought you'd be angry," she whispered. "I was," he said, his voice near her forehead, "at myself, for letting you walk away." A drop from the leaking roof fell onto her hand, cold, but the warmth in her chest burned through it. They sat by the dying coals without words. Each breath wove into the thin veil of smoke, each touch light enough to tremble but not break. That night, the wind never ceased. Yet inside the small cabin, something else began. A silence no longer empty, a love that asked for nothing, and two weary hearts that had finally found their shelter in each other. By morning the storm had passed. Drops of rain fell from the cabin roof, one by one, clear, steady, the sound of a world rinsed clean. The air still carried the damp scent of rain, mixed with the faint smoke of a dead fire. Tessa woke slowly, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall, Hank's coat draped over her shoulders like an unspoken promise. Across the hearth, he was crouched by the coals, coaxing the fire back to life. His wet hair hung over his brow. His bare shoulders caught the pale shaft of light leaking through a hole in the roof. He didn't turn, but somehow knew she was awake. "Fire's dying," he said quietly. "We'll need to dry our boots before heading back." His voice was low and warm, carrying that hesitant tone that lingers when some line has been crossed. Something sacred, fragile and too new to name. She nodded and sat up. His wrist bore a raw cut from the rains last night. The blood had dried, but the skin was swollen. She rose, knelt beside him. "Let me see." He held his arm out without a word. She took a strip of cloth, dampened it, cleaned the wound, then tore the inner seam of her blouse and wrapped it around his wrist. Their breath mingled, close enough for her to feel the slow thud of his pulse. "Does it hurt?" "Only when you stop touching it." She froze, then looked up. Hank wasn't smiling, but his eyes had softened. Deep, steady, the eyes of a man long used to solitude who had just remembered what it meant not to be alone. After a while he stood and poured water into the kettle, setting it over the rekindled flame. Steam rose in quiet spirals. He poured into 2 tin cups. "Tea," he said. "After all that rain, it's the only thing left warm." They sat facing each other in the damp cabin. The wind outside had gentled, carrying the scent of wet earth. Neither spoke of the night before. They didn't need to. Everything worth saying had already passed between them, in glances, in quiet, in the peace that followed storm. By the time they returned to Mercer Hill, the sun was high. The ground was soft and shining, the sky clear as glass. Mavis saw them from the porch, started to ask, but Hank only said, "The bridge held." She nodded, said nothing more. Tessa went straight to the kitchen, changed the water in the basin, rekindled the stove. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from a heart that hadn't yet learned calm. Every sound in the house carried a trace of him. The scrape of boots, the low breath, the faint tobacco scent he left behind. That afternoon, when she went to the yard, Hank was rebuilding the fence the storm had torn down. He worked slowly, deliberately, as if each swing of the hammer was a way to mend something larger than wood. She walked to him, took hold of one beam, and held it steady as he nailed it in place. They worked side by side in silence, the rhythm of hammer, breath, and wind the only language between them. When the last plank was set, Hank laid down the hammer, wiped his brow, and turned toward her. "I'll fix what they broke," he said, voice roughened by sun and effort. Tessa looked up at him, the sweat tracing her neck, her brown eyes calm as dark soil. "And I'll stand beside you," she said quietly. He didn't answer. but his hand, rough and scarred, found hers and held it tight. The hold was brief, yet it told her what words could not. She no longer walked alone. By dusk, the oil lamp glowed again behind the windows. Tessa sat at the table, reading psalms and sonnets. Outside on the porch, Hank sharpened his knife. The faint scrape of metal on stone beat steady like a heart. The shifting lamplight cast their twin shadows across the wall. Two figures, quiet, side by side. When Tessa looked up, she found him watching through the window. No hiding, no shame, just looking. In that stillness, she understood. The world beyond might bring gossip, judgment, and the sting of cruelty. But the night they had shared had changed everything. Somewhere in the hush between them, something had taken root. Not passion's fire, but faith. A faith strong enough to stand against the noise of the world, and warm enough to reignite a heart that once believed it had been sold forever. That morning, the sky was impossibly clear. After days of rain, the sunlight shone sharp as glass across the rooftops of Dry Creek. The air still carried the scent of wet earth, and someone remarked, "A fine day for bad words to travel." The rumor had spread as fast as always. Hank Mercer was going to the town hall to speak openly about the black woman living under his roof. Some came eager, some cautious. Others came only to see whether the proud rancher from the north would finally bow beneath the weight of gossip. Lucinda Boyd arrived early. Her velvet dress was deep blue, her hair coiled to perfection, her painted face betraying nothing of the whiskey haze she'd drowned in the night before. 3 men stood near her, one of them a familiar figure, a man she'd once swindled back east, now here by Hank's request. Tessa hadn't gone with him that morning. Hank had told her to stay at Mercer Hill, but as the wagon rolled away, her heart pounded with the ache of both fear and faith. At the square, Hank dismounted. His coat was mud-stained, boots heavy with clay, but his stride was unbroken, his gaze steady. As he climbed the wooden steps, the crowd fell silent. Lucinda smiled, her voice sweet as burnt sugar. "Mr. Mercer, how kind of you to bring the truth into daylight." Hank's eyes swept the faces before him, people he'd known for years, faces that once nodded in respect, now half curious, half cruel. "Truth deserves daylight," he said. A man from the crowd called out, "Then tell us, Mercer, did you buy her?" Hank lifted his head, voice ringing clear, firm without force. "I didn't buy her. I saw her." A ripple of murmurs swept through the square. He raised a hand, waiting until they quieted. "I saw her the day she was being sold, by a man too drunk to remember his own daughter's name. I paid not to claim her, but to stop a transaction that should have never existed." Lucinda laughed sharply. "And yet you kept her, in your house, under your roof. What does that make her?" Hank turned, his look so cold it strangled her laughter mid-air. "It makes her a woman who's worked harder than anyone in this town to keep decency alive, which is more than I can say for you." Lucinda's jaw tightened, her gloved hands curling, but Hank went on. "I had someone look into you, Miss Boyd. Seems you've been busy back east, charming men out of their money, leaving before they noticed what was missing. You're wanted in 2 counties. You didn't come back for family. You came to hide." The murmurs turned to heavy silence. One of the men stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat. The red seal gleamed in the sun. "Sheriff of Franklin County signed this last spring," he said. "Warrant for fraud and forgery. Name, Lucinda Boyd. Lucinda went pale. "You think they'll believe a rancher over a lady?" she hissed. Hank didn't answer her. He turned instead to the crowd, to the farmers, the blacksmith, the grocer's wife, all the people who'd once looked at Tessa with suspicion. "You all spoke of sin and shame," he said, each word deliberate. "You whispered about a woman you never knew. You thought she could be bought, because that's easier than admitting you misjudged her. Well, look now. The only one selling lies stands right here." Lucinda took a step back. Her heel slipped on the gravel. Someone in the crowd, the grocer's wife, said softly, "She made fools of us." Hank's voice dropped, rough with exhaustion. "I don't ask for apologies. Just silence. The kind that comes from shame, not cruelty. Let that be her justice." Lucinda looked around, desperate for a hand, a word, an ally. None came. Even the wind stilled. She turned sharply, skirts sweeping the steps, and walked away with trembling strides. When her figure disappeared beyond the street, Hank remained where he stood. He removed his hat, lifted his face toward the blinding sky. "Let it be known," he said, his voice carrying, "that from this day on, no one at Mercer Hill bears a name bought with shame." No one replied. The crowd began to break apart, boots scraping the dirt, heads lowered in quiet understanding. At the edge of the square, Tessa stood among them, her hands gripping her dress to keep from shaking. She hadn't needed to hear it all, only to see the way silence replaced mockery, the way eyes turned down in a wordless apology. Sunlight spilled across the wet ground, bright and clean. Just like that day long ago when she'd been put up for sale, but this time it was the light itself that bought her back her name. That afternoon, the wind came rolling off the prairie carrying the scent of dry grass and wildflowers. Overhead, clouds drifted slow and easy, as though the world itself had finally learned how to breathe after holding its storm too long. Mercer Hill stood still in the golden light, steady, quiet, no longer a house of rumors, but a place where truth had been proven. Hank was saddling 2 horses when Tessa stepped onto the porch. "We're going for a ride," he said. "Where to?" "You'll see." She climbed up behind him, holding lightly to the back of the saddle as they rode north, following a narrow trail through open hills. After the storm, the ground was soft, the air sweet with the clean scent of rain-washed earth. Neither spoke much. The steady rhythm of hooves was enough. Tessa could feel her heartbeat match its pace. When they reached an open stretch, Hank pulled the reins and stopped. Before them spread a wide plain, gold beneath the late sun. The grass rose high to the knee, untouched and waiting. A silver stream curved in the distance, catching light like a blade. Tessa stared. "Why are we here?" Hank dismounted, walked a few steps, and knelt. He scooped a handful of soil, pressed it in his palm, and looked back at her. "This is yours," he said. She froze. "Mine? You're giving me land?" He shook his head, voice steady but soft. "No, I'm giving you your name back." She didn't understand at first. He went on. "They said you were bought. They said you were owned. But no one owns this. Not the land, not the sky, not the soul. You'll build what you want here, grow what you want, call it what you want, and no one will ever take it from you again." Her throat tightened. She gripped her skirt to keep her hands from shaking. You'd do that for me? I'd do that because of you. Tessa knelt, touching the earth where the grass brushed her fingertips. The soil was cool and alive. She closed her eyes, feeling the quiet pulse of something that belonged not to anyone else, but to her. When she looked up again, tears shimmered at the edge of her lashes. Hank stood close, his shadow stretching long across the gold. She stepped nearer and laid a hand on his chest, not as gratitude, but as if to test that the moment was real. "What will you call it?" he asked. She turned toward the horizon, where sunlight poured down in bands of honey. "Faith," she said, "because once they said I couldn't be trusted, but now I trust myself." Hank nodded. "Then Faith it is." "Faith's field," she added, smiling faintly. "It sounds like a promise." The wind swept through the tall grass, tugging a few loose strands of her hair. Hank watched her, his expression softening into something between pride and awe. "Promise suits you," he said. "You keep the ones you make." Her smile deepened, the light catching the warm tone of her skin. "Maybe because no one ever kept theirs with me. I learned to." Hank lowered his head, took her hand gently. "Then maybe now it's my turn." For a long moment, they stood without words. Between them, silence was no longer a wall, but a bridge. Tessa walked through the field, her fingers trailing through the grass, each step pressing her story into the earth. Hank followed a few paces behind, watching quietly. She turned, the breeze lifting her hair. "This place will grow," she said. "It already has," he answered. The sun sank low, red and full behind the distant ridge. The light spilled across the field, gilding the grass in molten gold. Side by side, their shadows stretched long, merging as one across the land. "I used to think the world had no place for someone like me," she murmured. "You didn't need the world," Hank said. "You just needed your own field." She smiled, and a tear slipped free, not of sorrow, but of release. Faith's field, a name, a piece of earth, and a man patient enough to see her worth, not through promises, but through what he built with her in silence. As the evening wind moved through the tall grass, bending it gently toward the light, Tessa knew she was no longer the woman who had been sold, but the one who had been chosen. Not to be owned, but to be believed in. A year passed like the breath of wind across the prairie, light, steady, filled with quiet footprints of peace. By the next summer, Faith's field had changed. No longer a bare stretch of dust, it spread wide with young grass and wildflowers that Tessa had planted by hand. She had built a small hut where she taught the daughters of ranch hands to read and write, while Hank had dug a new well, drawing water enough for every patch of earth they tended. People said Mercer Hill wasn't the same since that woman came. She brought no noise, no riches, only life returning to a place that had once forgotten how to grow. Then, one bright June morning, Hank stepped into the kitchen, sleeves rolled, the scent of sunlight still clinging to his shirt. "Tessa," he said. She looked up from the table, hands dusted in flour. "Yes?" "Tomorrow, noon. I've asked Reverend Cole to come." Her hands stilled. Her heart did too. "For what?" He met her gaze, calm, certain. "For us." The next day dawned impossibly clear. Golden light spilled across the hills, and a soft wind from the north made the grass ripple like water. People gathered without invitation. None had been asked, but everyone wanted to see. There was no music, no grand carriage. Just two narrow rows of cut grass leading to a simple arch of leaves where Reverend Cole waited, the Bible open in his hands. Hank wore his old white shirt, sleeves pressed but collar unbuttoned. He had no flower pinned, no adornment, only the quiet dignity of a man at peace. Tessa wore the dress she'd sewn herself, pale cream fabric, puffed sleeves, a round neckline. Her hair was tied low with a thin cord, 3 wildflowers tucked above it, gathered from the field that morning. When she walked through the tall grass, the breeze lifted her hem, sunlight spilling around her until it seemed the sky and earth had met in her steps. Hank watched her come, each stride steady, each breath pulling him toward her. His smile grew slowly, not bright, but sure. Reverend Cole's voice, roughened by age, rolled over the field. "We are gathered here today not to bind what is already tied, but to honor what has chosen to stay." Tessa stood before Hank. He held out his hand, and she laid hers in his, a hand that had once trembled in fear, once split from labor, now steady and warm. The Reverend asked, "Mr. Mercer, do you take this woman?" Hank interrupted gently, his voice carrying clear in the wind. "I'll choose her even when no one sees." Someone in the crowd sniffed, quietly. Tessa couldn't speak at first. Her breath caught, her eyes burned. The Reverend turned to her. "And you, Miss Boyd?" She looked up at Hank. His eyes held the whole sky. "I'll believe us," she said softly, "even when I doubt myself." The Reverend smiled, closing the book. "Then by the grace of faith, you already are." Hank leaned forward, touching his forehead to hers. No kiss, just touch. The wind rushed through the field, carrying the scent of earth, sweat, and the honest life they had built from nothing. Applause rose like rainfall, soft, scattered, human. A woman whispered, "I wish love could sound this quiet." Another answered, "The best kind always does." That evening they returned to the wooden house. Mavis had lit the oil lamps on the porch. Their glow brushed across a freshly carved sign, Mercer and Boyd. Tessa ran her fingers over the letters. "It doesn't feel real." Hank stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "That's how truth feels. Quiet." Inside, the fire burned low. She set her wildflowers on the table. He hung his coat by the door. No words, no ceremony. Only two people breathing in rhythm, sharing the same stillness. She leaned her head against his chest. He whispered as if saying grace. "We built this from dust." She answered, "And it grew from love." Outside, the grass of Faith's field swayed like a living witness. No bells, no feast, no wine. Only wind, the fading sun, and two hands joined. So peaceful it brought tears to the eyes of those who watched. For in a world loud with noise, some weddings don't need to be heard. They only need two hearts that finally know they are home. That autumn, the wind over Faith's field carried the scent of beginnings. After the first rain of September, Tessa told Hank she wanted to build a small house at the edge of the field, near the stream where the land lay even. When he asked what for, she answered simply, "For those who were told they couldn't belong anywhere." He nodded, asked no more, and by the next morning, He was cutting lumber. 3 weeks later, the little house stood among the golden grass. It wasn't square nor fine, but it was warm and true. Hank built the tables and benches from old barn planks. Tessa whitewashed the walls, sewed her own curtains, and placed on the desk a few worn books she'd gathered from the church in town. On the wooden sign outside, she wrote in white chalk, "The School of Kindness." The first morning brought only 3 students. A mixed-race girl with bright curls named Ruth, a brown-skinned orphan called Clara, and a young mother who couldn't read, sitting quietly in the corner, her baby asleep in her arms. Tessa taught them the alphabet in a voice steady and soft, almost like a hymn. She drew each letter, told a story for each one. She taught them to sew buttons, to mend torn sleeves, and ostso. Most of all, walk with your chin up when you pass through the market. Let them see grace, not shame. The children giggled. They loved how she said grace, as if it were something you could hold. Mavis brought bread. Hank fixed the hinges and planted willow trees around the yard. "More shade for the little ones," he said. Tessa stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, smiling softly. "Everything you build," she said, "you build quietly." He replied, still bent over his work, "Quiet things last longer." By noon, the children were playing outside while Tessa wrote on the chalkboard. Hank carried in a few more chairs he had just finished. She wiped the sweat from his brow with a cloth. He nodded, wordless. In the slanted light, they looked like 2 people who had forgotten the world ever turned its back on them. One late afternoon, as Tessa guided Ruth through a poem, Hank sat by the door pretending to mend a saddle while listening to her voice. She read slowly, clearly. "Though storms may bend the field of grace, the roots remember still their place." Her words sounded like a prayer to the wind. Clara, the smallest of the girls, dropped her pencil and ran to the porch, tugging on Hank's sleeve. "Mr. Mercer," she said, eyes wide, "why did you pick Miss Tessa?" Hank blinked, caught off guard. "Pick her?" "Yeah," Clara said. "Mama says every man picks someone. So why her?" He was quiet a moment, then smiled and knelt so their eyes met. "Because she never needed to shine," he said, "for me to see light." Clara tilted her head, thinking, then grinned. "So, she's like the sun?" Hank chuckled. "No, she's like the soil. Everything grows because of her." Tessa heard him from inside. Her hand froze on the chalk. She didn't turn. She only smiled, her eyes blurring behind a haze of chalk dust and tears. Evening settled. The children left, their clothes dusty, their laughter trailing behind them through the field. Tessa stood in the doorway watching them go. Hank came beside her, hands in his pockets. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. "Of teaching? Of giving?" She tilted her head. The last light brushed across her hair. "You don't get tired of breathing, do you?" He smiled. "Not when it keeps me alive." The scent of wild daisies drifted on the wind. On the blackboard inside were 3 words she hadn't yet erased: faith, grace, kindness. They were everything she'd once been denied, and now she gave them away. Hank looked into the classroom, where the sunset spilled across the desks he'd built by hand. "It looks like a home," he said. "It is," Tessa answered softly, "for every girl who's never had one." As dusk deepened, they locked the door together. The hinges creaked like a whispered goodnight. Outside, Faith's field rippled in the wind. The field once named after her now carrying another name, gentler still. The school of kindness. And there, children once called invisible were growing strong, under the care of a woman once sold, who had bought back an entire land's belief in goodness. Years passed. Summer at Faith's field was no longer harsh. The ground that had once cracked open now bloomed with gold, sunflowers and wild daisies bending under soft wind. Along the hill, the willows Hank had planted long ago cast deep shade where children played. From a distance, the small schoolhouse still stood, its whitewash faded, its window frames darkened by time. Yet laughter still spilled from within, bright as it had been the very first day. Tessa walked the fence line, carrying a wicker basket of bread for the little ones. Strands of gray threaded through her hair, a few loosening to dance in the breeze. Every step she took drew the children to her, a dozen small feet racing, a dozen small voices calling, "Miss Tessa, read us a story." She smiled. "After chores, little one." From the porch of the main house, Hank looked up from his newspaper. His beard was silvering, his dark hair streaked with gray, but his eyes remained the same, clear and steady as the man he had always been. Beside him sat a steaming cup of tea and an old dog sleeping in the shade. As Tessa stepped onto the porch, he folded the paper and said quietly, "They're loud today." She set the basket down and looked over the field. "They're supposed to be. It means the world still grows." Hank smiled, placing the paper aside. "World seems smaller now," he said. "But somehow, it feels enough." Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, warm and sure. "Enough," she repeated softly. "That's the word I prayed for all my life." They sat together without speaking. The wind carried the scent of marigolds and turned soil. From the schoolhouse drifted the children's voices, reciting in uneven rhythm. Faith, grace, kindness. 3 words once written on a chalkboard, now the heartbeat of the land itself. Tessa watched the field, her chest filled with something tender and deep. The peace that comes only to those who have lived through storms and kept their kindness intact. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "about how it all began?" Hank turned toward her. "I do. Every time I see that old cloak hanging by the door." She laughed. "The one you threw at me in that wagon?" "The same one," he said, eyes distant with memory. "Didn't know then it'd be the first thing that ever fit us both." They both laughed, slow, tired, and full of warmth. By late afternoon, the children ran across the yard, tossing yellow petals into the air. One little girl caught a single bloom, holding it high. "Look, Miss Tessa, the sun fell in my hands." Tessa smiled, her voice soft as the wind. "Keep it safe. That's what love is, keeping a bit of light." When the children had gone, Tessa tidied the desks inside the schoolhouse. Hank sat on the porch, reading a frayed Bible, the one with corners bent from years of use. She joined him, settling beside his chair. "Do you ever regret," she asked, "that you bought me that day?" He looked up, the light of sunset flickering in his eyes. "They once sold you for being too plain," he said, his voice low. "And I still thank them, else I'd never have found what gold can't buy." Tessa looked at him a long time, her smile lined but serene, as gentle as the coming fall. "Faith's field," she whispered. "It grew more than flowers." "Yeah, Hank said, taking her hand, rough against hers. It grew us. A soft gust moved through the meadow, bending the yellow blooms as though bowing to their keepers. The last sunlight slipped across their shoulders, not bright, not fierce, but warm enough to color the whole land. From afar, the bell in the school rang one final note for the day. Children's laughter echoed as they crossed the meadow, leaving behind small footprints on the old dirt road. Hank's hand found Tessa's and held it. No words, just a quiet, steady clasp that carried the weight of a lifetime. Above the school door, the wooden sign reading Faith's Field had faded, but the letters were still there, faint yet certain. A field born from hurt, grown by faith, and forever blooming from the hands once sold, so that one day they might finally be seen. If this story has warmed your heart, or reminded you of someone who once gave you faith in a hard world, leave a comment below, or a simple like or subscribe, so we can keep sharing more quiet, honest love stories from the Old West. Because sometimes, all it takes is one small story to warm an entire evening.